I was in my 20s when I got run over by a drunk driver one night. It was not a good accident, it was a bad accident. When I came to in the ambulance, I said to the man who was attending me, "Am I going to die?" He very graciously said, "Not yet." I got to the hospital, they did some experiments, I'm on a table, I'm completely out of it. The doctor comes over and says, "Young man, we think you have a busted aorta. You have a 50-50 chance of making it through this evening." I'm 23 years old. My whole life is ahead of me. I have, again, no words for this. I never experienced anything like it before or since. I was beyond petrified. It was like a siren went off right next to my head. And of course, it was all beyond my control. I was terrified. I later learned that I have no imagination at all because I did what everybody else, apparently, according to the psychologists, does in our time and place when they're in this situation. You know what everybody does in this situation? You try to make a deal with God. "Oh God, get me through this and I'll do..." Honest to God, I have no memory of what my promise was. It was just, get me through this, right? But this is genetic. When you try to kill a spider and miss, it scurries away. It's genetically programmed to flee death. It does not want to die. Life does not want to die. So I was terrified when I was 23. I would like to think that this morning, at an advanced age, or more advanced, if death were to come knocking, I'd be a little less terrified. I sometimes imagine that maybe I would be brave, or maybe even enter it with faith. Now, I've asked myself, why am I less afraid of death now than I used to be? And here I'm not doing theology, I'm not reading the Bible, I'm just trying to analyze myself, and I think there are 4 reasons. Maybe you can identify with some of them. I'm going to focus on the 4th one, but here's the first one. As I grew older, I saw that there are situations in which death is welcome. I learned this firsthand. My mother's mother, my maternal grandmother, during her last week was not there. You know what it means when I say not there. But she was still talking. Last time I visited her, she said, "Help me, help me, help me, help me, help me." And that's all she could do. And I remember thinking, you need to die. You need to die. It will be good if you are no longer in this state. Death can be good. I remember when I had a thyroid issue and it wasn't diagnosed. I had no functioning thyroid. Probably somebody here has had this. No functioning thyroid, and it's not diagnosed. And for me, the world had no color. It had no feeling. It was like it was drained of meaning. And I remember walking around thinking, I don't want to go on like this. And without the miracles of modern medicine and this little tablet I take every day, I wouldn't have wanted to go on. It was just too miserable. Isn't that weird how little chemical can be that important? I don't like that, but it's a fact. I also had a very good friend, a Presbyterian minister, my first spiritual mentor, who jumped off a bridge on his 48th birthday because he had Huntington's disease. I have not forgiven him for jumping off a bridge, but Huntington's disease is one of those bad ones. And he couldn't face it. And he thought death was better. So, death, I suppose, was better for my friend, although I don't like the manner of his exit. So, I've learned that death can be welcome. Okay. The second thing that has drawn the sting of death a bit for me, now this is purely personal, is that I had dreams when I was a young person. When I was 11 years old, I fantasized that I would grow up and be a writer, and that's what I wanted to do. And look at that! Look at that! I actually had I'm one of those lucky persons who, as a young kid, said, I want to do this with my life, and I've actually done it. So I've lucked out, whatever the explanation. And at this point, I've actually achieved most of the things I've wanted to achieve. And now that I've done that, death doesn't seem so horrible. When I was 23, all my goals were still down the line. I hadn't met any of them. I wanted to live and meet them. Now, it's okay. But here is the third thing. Once I was lecturing on death at a seminary, and I had this thought that just overtook me. And I never had this thought before. And I thought, everyone who has ever lived has died. How hard can it be? Everybody does this. Now you're all laughing, but actually that gives me some comfort. It helps me. Yeah, everybody's done this. But here's the thing I want to talk about today. The fourth reason that I would like to think I would be less scared if death came knocking this afternoon is this. Human stories. Stories surrounding death. I have gained a great deal of reassurance from my own stories and stories from those I love and know and stories I have read from books. So, let me just tell you one thing that happened to me. No, two things that happened to me. So I had a friend who was less fortunate than I was. She was also run over by a drunk driver, one street over from where I was run over, and she did not make it. She spent a few weeks in a coma, and then she died. Well, to all appearances, ostensibly, okay, you gotta be careful here, but 3 days later, she woke me up in the night. Now that's how it appeared to me. Subjectively, this was real. Whatever you think objectively, this was real. She woke me up and she was standing at the end of my bed, and I remember thinking, she didn't say anything. I remember thinking, that is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen, and anyone in that state would be the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. It was a very powerful experience. And lots of people would just say, well, that's a nice hallucination. But I'm telling you, it's hard for me as the experiencer to look at this and say, was that really a hallucination? It sure didn't seem like it. Inside of it, it felt completely real and overwhelmingly real. And several weeks later, I was typing one of those books, volume 3, at the bottom of those 3 books. I was typing, that goes back a long ways. That was on a typewriter. If anyone remembers what a typewriter was. I was on my typewriter, and all of a sudden, oh, Barbara's here. I didn't see anything this time, but she was up to the left and behind me, and she said, well, she gave me an order. She said, you go do this right now. That's it. It was totally overwhelming. And in the moment, it was completely real. So I went to the phone, picked up the phone, and started to do what she asked me to do. Now again, maybe I was hallucinating, but I can tell you from inside those experiences, they didn't feel like I was hallucinating. They felt real. They felt so real, and they remain so real in my memory that I take some comfort from them. When my father died, I was not there. My wife, sitting right here, was there. And she came home, she walked in the door, and the first thing she said to me was, when your dad died and everybody left the room, he came back to me, and he said how relieved he was to be over this business. He had had a really bad, he had had brain cancer, and last part of his life was not real good. But you know what? This was amazing, folks. Now again, maybe my family is just inclined to hallucinate. Although genetically, I'm not related to my wife. But my son, my oldest son, Andrew, 3 days after my dad died, came in and said he'd been talking to Grandpa, and Grandpa had told him a secret, and so on and so on. Then my brother, 2 or 3 weeks later, says, I was walking down the street. Walking down the street, And all of a sudden, Dad started talking to me, and he told me I needed to do this, I needed to do that, I needed to do such and such. I've always remembered this conversation with my brother, because my brother said, I didn't know what to say. So I just said, how'd you like the funeral, Dad? And the voice said, I don't know, I got lost. Okay, now, what is all this about? What is this? Well, maybe people walk around and they just hallucinate all the time. But the stories that happened to me made me start going to the literature and reading psychologists and social psychologists and parapsychologists and other people who study visions and apparitions and things related to deathbeds. And I decided it's not all baloney, folks. Maybe some of you think it is. But I can tell you that subjectively, the sorts of experiences I just related are common. They are really common, and they are way more common than any of you think they are. I now know this. So what I'd like to do in the very few moments I have left is offer a sort of cartoon introduction to a handful of experiences, types of experiences that people have now been studying. The first one I'm going to talk about very briefly, because everything I'm going to do here today is briefly. I'm going to talk about something called terminal lucidity. And this is so new under the sun that it didn't get its name until our century, the 21st century. Now, I'll read a definition. Here is terminal lucidity. An episode of unexpected, spontaneous, meaningful, and relevant communication or connectedness in a patient who is assumed to have permanently lost the capacity for coherent verbal or behavioral interaction due to a progressive and pathophysiologic dementing process. People who have been in comas, who have had schizophrenia and been uncommunicative for weeks or months, or in a few cases years. People who have had Alzheimer's for long periods of time. And then right before they die, they sort of wake up and have a few minutes or an hour of lucidity. Like you get the old person back. I read the first serious article on this that was published, I think it was 2008. And I remember reading this and saying, that's really interesting. And then the people who wrote that, a couple of years later, wrote a second article. And for some reason, the press picked it up, and it got out on the internet, and people started reading it, and all of a sudden the people who wrote this were getting stories. Hi, I'm a doctor. I've seen this. Hi, I work in hospice. I've seen this twice. Hey, this happened to my mother, or whatever. And they started getting way more stories than they ever expected. The first conference on this was held in 2019. The first book on this was published last year. So we're still at the beginning of understanding what the heck this is. Well, we have enough stories now to know that this is a real phenomenon, and currently it's really hard to explain. So what do you do with a patient? This is a real story. I think this took place in New York City. This is back in 2007, I believe. So a patient has lung cancer. And as happens, as you know, sometimes with lung cancer, it metastasized to the brain. And the patient did not die quickly. The cancer ate the brain. And so they took brain scans, and most of the brain is gone. And this patient is uncommunicative. Couldn't even move. No expression, no response to anything. And then this patient begins the rough breathing of dying. You know how people they get that breathing thing going and it's not long? And then this person woke up. And for an hour talked calmly and coherently with family members. Patted the children, smiled, and so on. The attending physician wrote about this case. It wasn't David's brain that woke him up to say goodbye that Friday. His brain had already been destroyed. Now that's weird, isn't it? That's really weird. We don't yet know how common this is. If you'd asked the two people who wrote the first article on this when they wrote that article, how common is this? They would say not common at all. It appears that it's not common enough that you should expect it. But it is not so rare that if it happens, you shouldn't be surprised. How about that? But we don't know yet all the ins and outs of the details and so on, and if it's more common with Alzheimer's than some other condition, etc. They are working on this. But it's amazing. One more testimony. My mother had advanced Alzheimer's. She no longer recognized us, and she didn't even seem to care who these strangers were visiting her once or twice a week on the day before her passing. Day before, however, everything was different. Not only did she recognize us, she wanted to know what had happened in the course of the past year for every one of us. She'd been uncommunicative for a year. What's been going on? Delighting in good news, and she shed the odd tear over bad news. Her comments were as wise and caring as ever. When she heard that my younger daughter had recently broken off her engagement and descended into a deep depression, she wanted to talk with her for a while afterwards because she wanted to talk with her in private. My daughter never told me what she discussed with my mother, but it was a turning point for her. When we took our leave, we didn't know what to expect next. Was she miraculously healed? With hindsight, however, I believe that my siblings and me understood that she knew exactly that she didn't have long to live. She said goodbye to every one of us, held our hands, stroking them. She died that night. Don't get your hopes up. But I talked to a former hospice worker last week and asked her about this. She said no, she hadn't seen this, but she had heard of other workers who had seen this. Okay? Now, here's the second thing that people have been studying now. This, unlike the last subject, goes back to the end of the 19th century. But lots of study of visions of the dying. Visions that people have when dying. Here's a typical story. This is reported by a nurse. This gentleman was in a very weakened, debilitated condition where he needed two people to care for him when he just started talking. And he sat bolt upright, sounds like maybe terminal lucidity, sat bolt upright in his bed. And this was something very unusual. He was pre-terminal. He sat bolt upright and started this conversation just straight off the cuff, and he was looking over towards the doorway. And he was talking to the doorway. And I myself felt another presence in the room. And I said to him, "Who are you talking to?" And he said, "Oh, that's my brother." So he went on talking for a little bit longer, and I asked him another question, "Are you finished talking with your brother yet?" And then I felt the presence gone. And with that, he lay back down again, like he didn't have any strength to hold himself up any longer. Millions of stories like these, folks. Millions. But we're still at the beginning of gathering the data. Some people who have these visions don't want to talk about them. They're embarrassed, or family members are embarrassed and want to brush it all off. So the surveys I've seen are reporting now between 40 and 80%. So we're clearly at the beginning of this. But that means 40, somewhere between, 40 and 80% of people who are near death have visions. Visions mostly of dead loved ones, dead relatives, occasionally visions that they will say are of angels or Jesus. If you know any hospice workers, some of them will say, when the patient starts seeing dead relatives, the time is near. They're seeing dead relatives, probably not much longer. Also, interesting results like the fewer drugs, the more visions. That's not expected, is it? The fewer drugs, the more visions. Also, these are always interpreted, almost always interpreted as reducing anxiety, and the people who have them think so-and-so is coming for me. That's always the message. I'm going on a trip, I'm going somewhere, and somebody is coming for me. I have seen some fascinating videos, folks, from a hospice team in Buffalo, New York. They've been working on this lately, and they've been talking to people who are in the last week of life, who are, they say, having visions of dead loved ones. This stuff is unbelievable. Are you coherent? Yeah, I'm coherent. Are you hallucinating? No, I'm not hallucinating. What are you seeing? I'm seeing my husband. He's right there. You can't see him? No, I can't see him. Is this a hallucination? No, I know what a hallucination is, Dumbo. This isn't a hallucination. He's right there. This is weird. Now, they're in their last week, so they don't have as much energy as I just gave that. But they're saying, this is real. And I'm in my right mind, and I know what I'm seeing. This is really interesting, folks. It's really interesting. It's really interesting. So, terminal lucidity, these deathbed visions. And by the way, these deathbed visions have always been with us. They have always been with us. You can find references to dead relatives coming in all sorts of sources throughout world history if you look carefully. And I even think the Bible reflects this at some point. So as I said, 80–90% of these visions are of dead loved ones. But sometimes people will say an angel or a being of light or God or something like that. If you're from the Hindu culture, they have a name for this being that comes for you, the light being. This is from the Tibetan Book of the Dead. When your body and mind separate, the light being will appear, pure and clear, luminous and brilliant, with terrifying brightness, shimmering like a mirage on a plain in spring. Here's somebody from an ancient religious text, has nothing to do with our culture, and somehow they've got this story that, hey, when people die, this being comes and takes you somewhere. So, the next thing I want to talk about very briefly, and I guess I can do this because probably everyone here knows about this subject, but the subject is near-death experiences. And when you talk to the American public now and ask them, what's going to happen to you when you die? The most common answer is to give a typical synopsis of a near-death experience. Most people, it's above 25% now. When asked, what's going to happen to you when you die? They will say, well, I'll leave my body, I'll look down on my body, I'll go through a tunnel of light, my light will flash before my eyes, maybe I'll see my relatives or Jesus or a being of light or a ball of light at the end of the tunnel. That's a typical near-death experience, except the people who relate that, they haven't died, they've returned. Now, just a couple of things about near-death experiences. They're controversial, and there are people who think they're all purely subjective, but I don't think they are purely subjective. So first of all, I have this sense from talking to people who have had them. Remember talking to a woman once, she was a church secretary, and I don't know how she got a hold of me, but she did, and she told me this story, classic story. She had a spinal block when she was delivering, and it broke, and she came close to death, had a near-death experience, and she told me, you know what, I've never told anybody except my husband. By the way, that's really common in all these experiences we're talking about. You don't tell people. She says it's the most important thing that ever happened to me. I've always thought, that's amazing. You're in a church. You come to church every day. We're at church, you're around the church people, and you've never shared this with any of them. No. But she was sure this was the most important event in her life. I remember talking to an old, crusty homiletics professor at one of my former institutions. Didn't believe much of anything. One of those liberals who was so liberal that he didn't believe anything anymore. He got lung cancer. He had surgery. He came back. He was not too far from death. And he said, Dale, he said, when I was in surgery, I had one of those near-death experiences. He said, I always thought they were nonsense, but I had one. They're real. So I have a convert standing right in front of me, right? I'm a convert. And nobody converted him. It just happened to him. And he said, yeah, it's real. Several years ago, I was at a book fair in Brooklyn, Manhattan, somewhere up there, in that big, giant, horrible city. And these were authors who had written books on death. So I was one of them. And another one was a philosopher who had written a book on near-death experiences and thought that they were nice and pleasant, meaningful, but they were not in any sense real, right? Not objective, not veridical, there's nothing to them. So I said what I wanted to say, he said what he said, and so on. And then when we were done speaking, you know, people come up from the crowd, and some young man came over, and I noticed he talked to this guy, and talked to this guy, and talked to this guy, and we must have gone on 10 minutes. Finally, he came over to me. And I said, what are you talking to him about so long? He said, I've had a near-death experience, and I told him he didn't know what he was talking about. And I've been there, he hasn't, he doesn't know anything. So it's hard not to pay attention when people say these things, right? Or especially when you're sitting face to face with them and they tell you this. They're just sober and sane and saying this happens to you. But here's another reason, and I cataloged some of these in a recent book. You know, these people sometimes say that they left their bodies and they were floating above the ceiling and they saw some things going on below, right? Well, sometimes you can test this. Sometimes you can ask, did they really see something? So here are a couple of testimonies. So this testimony is from an ICU doctor. Okay, ICU doctor. I operated on a woman under general anesthetic, and when she woke up, she described her operation as if she had been on the ceiling. Not only that, she also described the operation that took place in the next theater, the amputation of a leg. She saw the leg. She saw them put the leg in a yellow bag. She couldn't possibly have invented that, and she described it as soon as she woke up. I checked afterwards, and the operation had indeed taken place in the next theater. A leg had been amputated at the very same time that she was under anesthetic and thus totally disconnected from the world. Now, that's just one story. But what if you have 200 like this? We do have, I have a book with over 200 of these now. And they're all from doctors and attending nurses and emergency personnel who talked to people who were out of it, gone, not there, and they reported seeing things that they couldn't have. So here is a cardiothoracic surgeon. The patient talked about the bright light at the end of the tunnel, as I recall, and so on, but the thing that astounded me was that he described the operating room floating around and saying, I saw you, Dr. Such and Such, standing in the doorway with your arms folded. I saw I don't know where the anesthesiologist was, but he came running back in, and I saw all of these post-it notes sitting on this TV screen. And what were those? What those were any call I got, the nurse would write down who called and the phone number and stick it on the monitor, and then the next post-it would stick to that post-it, and then I'd have a string of post-its of phone calls I had to make. He described that. I mean, there is no way he could have described that before the operation, because I didn't have any calls, right? He described to see things there is no way he knew. I mean, he didn't wake up in the operating room and see all this stuff. Now again, I don't know how many of these it takes to convince one this is a real something. Some sort of perception that we shouldn't have. But I've read enough of these now to think, yeah, some of these people are perceiving things that they can't perceive. Or they shouldn't be able to perceive if all we do is perceive through our eyes and ears and so on. Okay, the next thing. I'm running out of time. The next thing is visions, apparitions of the dead, not by people who are dying, but by people who are not dying. That is, apparitions like mine, where somebody dies and I see her 3 days later. We know a lot about this. By the way, we've learned so much that the 1975 edition of the Comprehensive Textbook on Psychiatry says that having bereavement visions, right, is abnormal. It's a sign of psychosis. The current edition says this is a normal response to bereavement. So at least we've learned that much. We've learned that so many healthy people have these things, and they don't create problems. They usually bring comfort. now know lots of things. How about this? These are generalizations from the literature. More often than not, these visions offer reassurance and give comfort. They give guidance, make requests, and issue imperatives, like happened to my family. They are overwhelmingly real and indeed seemingly solid. Most apparitions are not ghosts. The stereotypical ghost is a sort of see-through Casper thing. No, most ghosts are real. They just look like you and me. They might be missing the bottom half, but otherwise they look like you and me, not all of them. How about this? This is one testimony. He looked and felt just like when he was living. He didn't look like something you could see through neither time. He just looked real, alive, real. Now this is really strange. How weird is this? I put my arms around him. It felt just like you or I, just real. You know, like the Lord reappeared. Just, you know, when he died, he was alive and he asked the man to feel a nail hole in his side. My husband was just as real as if he was here with me now. Whatever these are, they're not ghosts. They appear and disappear usually in abrupt ways. They're just there, and then they're just gone. They don't usually walk in and stroll out. They manifest so convincingly that a recipient undergoes a change in belief. Some people who have these say, oh, I guess death isn't the end. They are also seen less and less as time goes on. The further you get away from a death, the less you see. All right, very briefly, a couple of more. There's something in the literature called SOP. We've known about this for a while, but again, more studies recently. SOP is sense of presence. And given how many people are in this room, I know that some of you have had this. This is the experience of having a loved one die, and then after death, just being overwhelmed by a sense of presence. SOP. That person is here. That person is with me. This is really common, folks. From time to time, since the deaths of both of my grandfathers, I have had the feeling of the sense of their presence in my bedroom just before going to sleep. I just feel they are near, standing next to the bed. It makes me feel reassured that maybe they're looking after me. Another one. I had this feeling that Matt was there in the room. I tried to shrug it off. As I turned to my left to look at Allison and Marie, they were both looking at me, wearing the most unusual expressions. The silence seemed forever until I said, "Do you feel what I feel?" Almost in unison, they nodded their heads and said, "Yes, we all feel he was there." Another one. It was as if the room was filled with his presence, a presence almost palpable, as vivid and real as if he had just physically entered the room, spoken to me, or touched my shoulder. When my father died, I had a feeling of his presence. I knew that he was not dead, but alive. Surveys differ on the numbers here, but I have seen surveys that put this experience as around 50%. That is, if you lose a dead spouse, within a year, you will, 50% of the time, have some experience like this. By the way, these experiences I'm talking about, visions, apparitions, sense of presence, and so on, they really are common. So, one of my favorite illustrations of this is from some social psychologists in Denmark, and this is in the late 1990s, and they were at a nursing home, and they had enough anecdotal evidence to think that a parent, ostensible, at least subjective, encountering of dead loved ones was not so rare. So they wanted to find out how common it was. So they went to this nursing home, and they interviewed 50 people and said, "Have you ever been in contact with your dead husband or wife?" One of them said yes. 1 out of 50 said yes. So they went back to the office and they said, "We must be doing something wrong. We suspect it's more than this." So, they had an idea. So they went back to this place, to the nursing home, and they said, "Being in contact with the dead is not a sign of mental illness. It's, we think, pretty common. There's nothing wrong with it, nothing to be embarrassed about. It happens to normal people. And instead of one person saying yes, 25 said yes. In other words, it went from 2% to 50% just by reframing the question. Now that tells you how common some of these things are, but they don't come out unless you have the right situation. Right? Okay, now there are more things to talk about. The things I've talked about today are actually called now, there's a designation, ELEs, end-of-life experiences.
This is just water.
Yeah, that's okay. I'm used to being walked out on. So Mike said that I should leave some time for questions, but let me say one thing here. This subject really matters to me. Death and what might lie beyond, they really matter to me. First of all, I want there to be a life after this one. I'm just prejudiced. I have a bias up front. I do want to continue living. I also know that some people say, this is just no good, Dr. Allison. People who are too heavenly minded are no earthly good. Have you ever heard that? Or people are just waiting for pie in the sky. That means they're not socially responsible in the present. Maybe there's some truth to this, but I've actually thought, you know what? If tomorrow everybody in the world ceased believing in an afterlife, let's just say tomorrow everyone in the world quit believing in an afterlife, would there be no more war? Would there be no more poverty? Would there be no more cruelty? Would there be no more racism? Of course not. I don't see any correlation at all here. I actually don't get it. A lot of people might just say, let's eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. Right? Who cares? But I also care about this because as much as I love life, and as much as I've been blessed, and as many friends as I've had, and as wonderful a family as I have, I know that the world is full of misery. And I know if I've achieved my dreams, tons of people have not. I know the world is full of 1-year-olds who have died, and 2-year-olds, and 3-year-olds, and 4-year-olds, and people who have died of leukemia when they're 8. People who were born in slavery or horrific circumstances, who haven't had the chances that I've had. I actually think that if I look around the world, despite all the goodness I see and the good in people and so on, I think if there's nothing beyond this, I might be an atheist. I think if God is really good, and if God really loves everybody, if God is madly in love with the world, it makes no sense that this is all there is. It just cannot be. So for me, thinking about life and death are related to the problem of evil. And I don't see an existential solution to the problem of evil for so many people who were just born and died and had nothing. I don't understand it unless there is something beyond. The meaning of most stories is in the end. The meaning of most stories is in the end. And I'd like to think that God is in the end and make sure that all these stories have meaning. Okay, I guess I have 5 minutes, is that right? If there's anything anybody wants to say, I will listen.
I'm 93 years old. I've seen a lot of death, and it really hasn't affected me that much. I don't know if there's nothing wrong with me, or...
No. I don't know you from Adam, so I wouldn't say there's something wrong with you. Do you have an explanation of this? I mean, so does that mean also you've never feared death? I mean, even as a child, for example? just wondering.
You might not have heard.
Oh, I'm sorry. Has death ever been a problem for you? If I may be so bold, sorry. Maybe not. Okay. Yeah.
What has been the biggest source of skepticism from people who have trouble believing in the visions and the apparitions and near-death experiences? What holds them back from believing?
Well, so there are two things. One is that there are such things as purely endogenous, non-veridical visions, apparitions, hallucinations. So when somebody is seeing locusts coming out of the hospital TV screen, nobody thinks this is real. We can hallucinate, right? And we can hallucinate very vividly. There was one patient whose story is actually fascinating because she was able to create hallucinations at will, and they were completely real to her. So we know that's possible, right? People can hallucinate. But the other thing, I think it has in large part to do with worldview. So there are people, at least in my part of the world, in academia, who would call themselves materialists or reductive materialists, and none of this stuff makes sense within their framework. And they would say, my framework is justified by the success of materialistic science, which has shown us. They would claim that there really isn't anything else. So there's no invisible world, there's no transcendent anything, there's no life after death. It's just what we see, it's chemicals, and so on and so on. And that's their reasoning. I really think, I may be wrong, because skepticism can be insurmountable, and we're all within our worldviews. But these reports of veridical receptions from doctors and nurses and so on, I'm not seeing a convincing response to that. The other thing, we're about done here. The other thing that I would point to, and I didn't pay much attention to this morning, but there are lots of these experiences that are perceived by more than one person at the same time. Sometimes nurses in the room will see what the patient is seeing. Now that's unbelievable, if true, if you can believe that, you know. So in the episode I read, the nurse is not seeing the person being spoken to, but I had found accounts where a nurse said, yeah, I saw it too. What do you do with that? So if we get enough of those, at some point, I'm just going to say, if you don't believe that, something's wrong with you. Now maybe we haven't got to that point, but I have noticed in the literature these popping up. Yeah, nurses are reporting the deathbed visions too with the patients. Strange. There are some accounts also of like 10 people in a room seeing what's going on at the same time. So if you get enough of those, there's something strange and mysterious going on here.
I'll say also, as a pastor, I have been blessed to have those conversations with people, and I've been fortunate to have some of those things shared with me that people have experienced. And so I'm curious. I'm not going to ask if any of you have had the experience, and you studiously avoided asking this, but if you've ever had someone that you know or love share with you an experience like this, if you would just put your hand up, because I certainly have had. Yeah.
There you go. They're all crazy.
We want to say thank you to Professor Allison for being here with us this morning. He will join us for the next 3 weeks on Zoom on those big screens. We hope we'll all gather here for refreshments to hear what he presents in the next 3 weeks, and then the final week of the series, he'll be back with us in person again. So thank you, and also welcome to Chris, his wife, and his family. We'll see you in worship.
I'm just glad we can come back and tell y'all what we did.
We don't